All right, let me introduce the presenter for this class, Beth Taylor. Beth is a certified genealogist and works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University and has worked for Family Search for almost 20 years. Her specialties and interests include DNA, Quakers, land records, probate records, organizing, and much more. So welcome, Beth. I will turn the time over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. So let's go ahead and get started with the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses. Note that we are just talking about U.S. immigration up until 1954, from 1820 to 1954. And we'll find out in a minute why we're focusing on this particular time period. So when we approach immigration strategy, the first thing that we want to kind of consider is what is it that we're looking for? What is it we're hoping to find? So what usually we start with is something like this. You're looking for a man named John Smith. He's born about 1863, born in Germany. And it's really easy at this point to say, okay, I know he's born in Germany. I'm just going to go look for John Smiths who were born about 1863 in Germany because, right, I'm ready to jump the pond. I'm ready to go look for research in John's homeland, which is Germany. In reality, when you're trying to trace somebody from the United States to their country of origin, you need a lot more information. So you really have to start with the records in the United States in order to learn more about John. So you're hoping not just to know that his name is John Smith, you're actually hoping to know a lot more, that really he's Johann Schmidt, that you have, if you can, get a specific birth date, a specific location, like Onklum, and I'm not a German researcher, so I'm going to say all of the names wrong, but he was born in Prussia, a date he immigrated, maybe a date he naturalized, maybe who his parents were, his siblings. Anything that you can learn about him here in the United States is going to make it much easier to find the right John Smith or Johann Schmidt in Germany when you go look at those records, because there's not a really easy way to just say, oh, he's born in Denmark or he's born in Sweden or he's born in England and find him. The more you know about him before you try and make that jump back to their homeland, the more successful, the more likely you are to actually find the right person in that country of origin. So today, our goal is to kind of give you some strategy and some focus and some background information about immigration to the United States. So our objectives today, we're going to go through some history and background about immigration, when people came to the United States, why they came. We'll go through some clues in U.S. records. One of the biggest mistakes I think we make is that it's very easy to immediately say, okay, I'm just going to look for immigration records and then I'm going to the country of origin. There's actually a ton of records here in the U.S. that might provide some of the key information that you need in the country of origin, such as, their original name, their death, their some dates, some relationships, anything that you can gather. We'll then talk about some homeland records, the immigration records themselves here in the U.S., and then some records for those homelands, some immigration records that might help. We'll go through some research strategies. How do you tackle an immigration case where you're trying to find that homeland? And then we'll go through some immigration resources, where you're going to find some of these records and some other ideas. So hopefully we're ready to get started here, kind of tackling all of these things. Let's start with the history and background. One of the first things I like to kind of pull up is just kind of get a sense of the immigration rates over time. Again, looking for that 1820 to 1954 time period. And as you can see, there were, the immigration rates were pretty low up until about 1854. We get some drops, some spikes, the biggest spikes coming in about 1907 and then again in 1914. And then it's kind of dropped off over the years. So one of the things that I like to do is think, okay, what is causing those spikes? Why are people coming? What's pushing them to come to the U.S.? So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about are the laws related to immigration to the U.S. Because if we better understand the laws and the acts that kind of guided immigration, you can understand why more people came at different times and things that might have prevented them from coming. So the first major immigration law in the United States was the 1819 Steerage Act. It's also known as an act regulating passenger ships and vessels. Now, this act was the first attempt by the US federal government to actually gather passenger lists. Prior to this act, there's no official passenger lists on a federal level. There were a few ports that required them, such as Philadelphia, but other than that, what you'll find is that there's just no passenger list. So it's harder to find people pre-1820. That's why we have that year in here. So the passenger lists were meant to be filed with a customs agent at the port of entry. However, not all ports had a customs agent. So if there wasn't a customs agent at that specific port, you're not going to get passenger lists. Those passenger lists were actually forwarded on to the US Secretary of State, so that's where they were compiled. And this law went into effect, or this act went into effect, on the 1st of January, 1820. So that's why passenger lists in the United States date to 1820, the ones that are on the federal level. So again, that's why we're focusing with starting in this year. There are several other major immigration acts, including one in 1855, but we're going to jump to the 1891 Immigration Act, which is one of the big key ones and is just going to really change the way passenger lists are kept. The 1891 Immigration Act was an act and amendment to various acts relative to immigration, and it went on. I love it when they try and name these acts, but this act actually required that the passenger lists be filed with a federal inspection agents as opposed to those customs agents. And that kind of changed things because the federal inspection agents, instead of, you just show up and give your passenger list to a customs agent, the federal inspection agents are actually going to come on board the ship prior to docking to collect those passenger lists. So it's a little bit more organized, a little bit more structured. The agents, like I said, boarded the ship prior to docking. And in addition to boarding the ship, this act was the first attempt to evaluate how the immigrants themselves were being treated. Prior to this, mostly they were worried about the ships themselves. Were they bringing the cargo? But this was more about the people as opposed to the ships. This 1891 Immigration Act, so this is kind of the federal government taking over a lot of the immigration process as well. This Immigration Act is also what allowed for inspection stations along both the Canadian and Mexican borders. Prior to this date, if you wanted to immigrate in through Canada and cross the border, there's no evidence of it. There might be a passenger list into Canada, but there won't be anything indicating you crossed the border. The border was very just nebulous. You just walked across it and you were in the US. So at this point, the act allowed for it, and we'll talk a little bit more about border crossings in a few minutes. And then the next law I'm going to mention, and like I mentioned, there's a lot of major laws related to immigration, but the next really big one was the 1924 Immigration Act. This was an act to limit the immigration of aliens into the United States. Sometimes this is known as the Quota Act as well. So at this point, the whole process of immigration was changed. And instead of coming to the US and being inspected here in the US, you actually had to acquire a visa prior to sailing if your plan was to immigrate. So those visas were either obtained at a consular office or a US embassy in either the country of origin, or if you were a displaced refugee and, somewhere else if you could. And then this act also set quotas. There had been an attempt to set quotas based on you can only have this number of immigrants from this country. It was meant to let more Western and Northern Europeans into the country. It was based on the number of immigrants. I believe it was either on the 1880 or 1890 census that had come from that country. So the more you had, it meant that people coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe had a harder time immigrating because of the quotas. So just kind of this is changing the whole process. You get that inspection prior to coming to the US, so you're not coming and being inspected like the traditional Ellis Island story. It does change things quite a bit. So that's one of the things that's going to impact how people immigrate, why they immigrate, when they immigrate. But another thing we want to think of, what's causing the people to want to immigrate. And so we're going to talk about two things: push factors, what's pushing them out of their homelands. Because immigrating is a huge deal. So why pack up all of your things and decide to come to another country? We'll also talk about pull factors, things that are pulling them to the US. So some of the push factors, things that are going on, there were some countries that had required military service, and young men who didn't want to serve in the military might try and slip across the border if they could, or, leave the country. There were famines. A lot of us are familiar with the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. There's not enough food. Where can we go? A lot of people ended up immigrating. There's a lot of overcrowding. As we get the Industrial Revolution, the people from the rural areas kind of pressed into the cities, and the cities in Europe became very full. And we're talking Europe, but this is, true for any immigration. But there were, overcrowding leads to unemployment. There wasn't a lot of social mobility. Either you were in the peerage or you weren't. And in a lot of places, you got political upheaval or unrest going on. If there were wars or rumors of wars, or the even geographical things like volcanoes erupting, or the situations like, for example, when the Jewish people were treated unfairly, then that would push a lot of people to leave. So these are all pushing people out of their homelands or their countries of origin. But there are also things that pull people to the United States. So some of the pull factors, one of the biggest ones was land. I mean, there's a huge amount of land in the US. Geographically, it's very large. And at that time, some of it was, or a lot of it was still unsettled. I mean, it hadn't been farmed. And so there were a lot of opportunities to come and get your own acreage and settle down. And the US even offered free land starting in about 1862 with the Homestead Act. Of course, religious freedom is another thing that might pull people who don't want to be the main religion or the state religion in their country of origin. There were employment opportunities. They might have relatives living in America already who were writing home and saying, hey, get some free land, or there's more opportunities, or we just want to see you again, which led to what we call chain migration, where you'll get families coming kind of piecemeal, where you get, the father coming and then sending money back to the family, and then you get the older children coming and they send money home until the mother and the young children come. And then that starts over when they invite, the mother's brother's family, and they do that again. So there's a lot of reasons, people are coming to be with family, they're coming for land, they're coming for a lot of various reasons. So as you think about your own ancestors' story, why they came, you might not know exactly, but kind of consider what's going on in their country of origin and their homeland, and then what's also going on in the United States. So what's pushing them and what's pulling them. So as we go back to our wonderful graph showing rates of immigration over time, you'll notice there's a lot of things that are going to be part of that push and those pull factors. Now, one of the things that I didn't really pull up, but I do think is interesting, is some of the dips, the decreases in the immigration rates. You can tie them to two big things, either wars. So, the Civil War, suddenly you're going to get a drop in the number of immigrants, and financial difficulty. So nobody immigrated during the Great Depression because, there's really nothing to immigrate to. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about immigration routes. I am, again, focusing here mostly on Europe. You want to kind of consider, where are people coming from? Where are people coming to? And traditionally, I think it's easy to assume everybody did the standard, Liverpool to Boston or to New York is the standard immigration route. However, there are a lot of other immigration routes. And here in the United States, there are other major ports, and those should be listed in your handout. That includes Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Galveston, Texas, I believe is one of them. And then there were people who went to San Francisco sailing, around South America for a while until the Panama Canal opened. I think it was in 1914. I might have the year wrong on that. Then you also want to consider that some immigrants actually came in through Canada. That there were companies that would go to Europe and they would say, hey, we'll sell you a ticket to the US, but it'll be cheaper if you sail in through Canada and then cross the border by rail or other means. And so they'd kind of sell them a joint ticket. So that's also a very common immigration route. And then as you're looking for ports of departure in Europe, you want to make sure that you're considering that the place they left from had to have been on the coast. So if you have, ancestors from Germany or from Poland or, other areas, they're going to have to travel to a port first, and that port might not be in their homeland. So that's okay. That's just expected. They're going to have to get out of to the edge of Europe to catch a ship. And then there were people who would sail from Europe to England, cross England, and then sail out of England. So there might have actually been two parts of their immigration journey there. So keep that in mind. There's not just one immigration route to the United States. I do want to make a small mention just of the Port of New York, because we tend to assume that everybody who immigrated came in through Ellis Island, but that's actually not the case. Up until 1810, the busiest port in the United States was actually Philadelphia, not New York. So it wasn't until 1810 New York does pick up and become the busiest port. In 1855, the state of New York, this isn't the federal government, the state of New York felt like there were tons of people coming, and they needed to figure out how to process them better and make the experience, more streamlined. And so they opened an immigration station at Castle Garden. The Castle Garden actually closed in 1891 as kind of that same time period with the 1891 Immigration Act, because instead of the state of New York handling immigration, that's when the federal government picked up and built Ellis Island. So Ellis Island, part of the reason they constructed the immigration center on Ellis Island was actually, some people think, oh, it was so we could detain immigrants and things like that. But there was actually there's also a nicer reason as well. Castle Garden, what would happen is we got, I don't know a nice term, people who weren't so nice to the immigrants, who would speak their languages, who would kind of hang around Castle Garden. And when the immigrant ships came in, they would offer to, help them out in their own language, and then they would abscond with all of their money and all of their possessions, leaving these immigrants destitute and, and then not sure what to do. And not speaking the language. And so one of the reasons to build the Ellis Island on an island was to prevent this from happening. And so that people coming in were not being preyed upon by some of the local, whatever you want to call them, thieves, I guess is what they really are. So Ellis Island actually opened in 1892. Now, there was a fire on Ellis Island in 1897 that burned the entire detention center, the entire immigration station. That fire meant that immigrants were processed on the Battery on the tip of Manhattan for a few years. That's also where immigrants were processed between 1890 and 1892 while they rebuilt Ellis Island. Luckily, the records weren't destroyed because they'd filed copies with the U.S. Secretary of State. So we do have the records, but there were a copy that burned. And then starting in 1924, same with that 1924, the Immigration Act, because people were now being processed or they had to get those visas prior to their immigration, that meant that Ellis Island actually only handled displaced persons and war refugees. So people who couldn't, war refugees really obviously couldn't go to their, to get a visa in their country of origin. They've already left. And so they would still process them at Ellis Island. But Ellis Island kind of dropped in and what it was doing at that point. And then it closed its doors officially in 1954. And a lot of that is because immigration moved from coming by ship to more and more coming by air. So we get this difference going on. So kind of keep in mind that if you've always assumed, your ancestor came in 1873, that they came through Ellis Island, they didn't. Ellis Island did exist at that point in time. Okay, so next let's talk about the clues that you'll find in other U.S. records about an ancestor's immigration, because we do want to start by focusing on U.S. records and gather all of those clues so we can know which Johann Schmidt is ours in Germany. So we do start with those U.S. records. That includes things like home sources, census records, vital records, obituaries, church records, county histories, naturalization records, military records, and there's probably other records as well. But let's take a look at some of these. One thing to note, though, with all of these records is these records contain secondary information about immigration information. So there could be some errors. And so as you work with these records, you might find they conflict with each other. And so you'll have to work with that conflict to actually figure out when the person immigrated. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's start with home sources. By home sources, we mean things like family Bibles, letters. A lot of now immigrants were writing home, writing back and forth, especially that chain migration. Somehow they had to know how to get to them, how to come back. Naturalization papers, pictures. Pictures can be great if you want to look at the studio who took the picture, if you've got that information. Even if it doesn't have a name or date and place, the studio might at least point back to a specific town in Germany, and you know they must have been near that point, at that place at some point in time. Now, if you don't have these records, try and think who did. You know, when the oldest generation passed away, who cleaned out the house, who might have that box, because some of these things are just hiding in attics and in basements and garages. So reach out and see if these things have been kept by somebody. Don't forget census records. Census records are one of the very first places when I'm helping somebody with immigration, I almost always start just to see what's on the censuses. So keep in mind that censuses asked a lot of information about immigration. So if we could, going back a little bit earlier in time, 1820 to 1840 actually asked for the number of the individuals in the household who were foreigners, meaning not naturalized. From 1850 forward, we get the place of birth. And keep in mind that in Europe, not all locations had, you know, Europe's had a lot of changing in place names. For example, Germany wasn't what we know as Germany until 1871. So you'll get a section or a location in Germany, not a town, but a region of Germany in those censuses, those 1850, 60, and 70 censuses. 1870 census actually asked if the individual was a male and a citizen age 21 or older, indicating they were naturalized. We'll talk more about why naturalization is so important for finding immigration information in a minute. From 1880 to 1930, it asks for the place of birth of the father and the mother, which is going to be helpful if they're a child of immigrants. From 1900 to 1930, we do get immigration information, including the year of immigration and the number of years in the United States. From 1910 to 1920, it asks for their native tongue. Now, consider whether if your ancestor might have been living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they might list the town of the place of birth as Austria, but the native tongue might be something that tells you that they spoke Czech, which tells you where in the Austro-Hungarian Hungarian Empire they're coming from. They're not coming from Austria, they're coming from Czechia. 1920 asks for the native tongue of the parents, same thing, that's going to be helpful. The 1900 to 1950 censuses asked for naturalization information. They used a couple little codes, just so you know that NA means naturalized, PA means papers filed, and AL means alien. PA does not mean Pennsylvania, and AL does not mean Alabama in the naturalization columns. I've seen a few people a little confused thinking, why did my ancestor go to Alabama to get naturalized? No, it just means they're an alien, meaning they haven't started the naturalization process. And then the 1950 census just said yes or no, are you naturalized? And then the 1920 census asked for the year of naturalization. Like I said, we'll talk about why naturalization is so important in a minute. So let's take a look at an example of a census record that has immigration information. This is the 1920 census for a man named Hector Boyardee. You might have heard of him before. He's now known as Chef Boyardee, and he has a whole food line named after him. But if you'll notice over on the right side, it indicates that he was immigrated in 1914 and that he's filed his first papers. Again, naturalization, there's several pieces of the process, and he's done the first one. So that's what those numbers, the things mean over on the far right side. But it also tells us he was born about 1897 in Italy, which is helpful as well. Next, we want to look at for vital records. Vital records being civil records of births, marriages, and deaths here in the United States. Keep in mind that vital records may give a little bit more information about somebody's place of origin, where they came from. So make sure to look for their marriage record if they married here in the United States. Look for their death record as well, and then trace the records for all of their children, including birth records, marriage records, death records. Keep in mind that, death certificates actually have a place on the death certificate itself that says, where was the parents born? Now, a lot of times you just get the country, but once in a while somebody puts a little more information, so it's worth looking for. So here's an example. This is actually from 1843 in St. Louis, Missouri. It says that Mr. Frederick Sporleder of, and I'm going to not be able to say these places right, but I'll try, of Furstenberg, Braunschweig, and Miss Carolyn F. Horsch of Eschwege. Oh, I'm not even going to say that one. They were married the 27th June, 1843 by G.W. Wall, a German evangelical preacher. So here's an 1843 record that's actually giving us towns of birth in Germany. So keep in mind that, it's rare to find these, but it's worth looking for them. Also keep in mind obituaries oftentimes list more information. They might not list the exact town of birth, but they might tell a little bit about their immigration experience. So here's an example. It says Mr. Rose was born in Offenbach, Prussia, Germany, October 23rd, 1842. When 14 years of age, he came alone to America, landed in New York, and located at Cleveland, Ohio. So that's very important. Further down, it says Mr. Rose is a son of Moses and Sarah Levy Rose. His father was a native of Prussia, and his mother was born in Baden and died in 1878. They had a family of 6 sons and 5 daughters, and Charles was the 3rd son. So lots of good information here as we want to track back to Germany. This might be one of the better records that we'll find that can help us out. Another record similar to vital records that you want to look for are church records. Keep in mind that a lot of immigrants continued attending the same denomination that they had in their country of origin. So if they're coming from England, you want to look for Church of England records or Anglican or Episcopal records. If they came from Germany, they're probably either going to be Lutheran, also sometimes known as evangelical, or they're going to be Catholic. So knowing what what country they came from might suggest what church they attended. So like with vital records, you want to look for their marriage records, their burial records, and the records for their children, because these are all opportunities for a parish priest or a minister who's got a lot of, interest, or might that they themselves come from that same homeland. They might record where that person was born or where the parents were born for the children. So here we have an example. I won't make you read it. It's because it's in German. But this one says that Heinrich Mahl was born in that location in Prussia, the 10th of August, 1821, and died in Mount Vernon, Indiana. And he left a son and a daughter, which I love that they even included that in his burial record. So again, here's a U.S. record for an individual born in 1821 that gives us a town of birth. But you do want to track down those church records. Another record to take a look at are county histories. County histories we sometimes call mug books, but they usually had a section that were biographies of either prominent citizens in the community or even citizens in the community who had money and wanted to write up a bio and publish it. And don't just look for your ancestor, look for anybody related. I've even seen like a son-in-law might have information as it talks about the son-in-law's wife's parents. So here we have an example. It says Robert Moore was 3rd, 1843, near Loughbrickland, County Down, Ireland, the birthplace of his ancestors for several generations. It says he was educated in his native country, attended school, and then when he was 15 years and 6 months old, I love how specific it is, he accompanied his uncle William T. Shannon to America. They made the ocean voyage in the steamship City of Baltimore and landed at New York. Because, of course, the city of Baltimore went to New York, not Baltimore. So just kind of keep in mind that these county histories can have some really, really valuable information as well. Next, we'll kind of talk about naturalization, because naturalization, we've mentioned it a few times. Naturalization is the process of becoming a citizen of the United States. Naturalization, we first had people naturalized, or was mandated under the Naturalization Act of 1790. And there's a three-part process. You start by filing a declaration of intent, then a petition, and then a certificate. Now, if you want to know more about naturalization, earlier this year, we actually taught a naturalization class. So maybe one of my team members could put a link to that class in the chat. So if you want to go in more depth into what naturalization is, that would be a great class to refer to. There was one major act after that 1790 act that is really important because it required more information. So the Naturalization Act of 1906 standardized the naturalization process, and then it actually required that those filing for naturalization include a lot of detail. That includes their date and place of birth, the date and port of immigration, their current address and their foreign address from where they came from, and the name and birth information for their spouse and children. So lots more information after 1906, where I was like, did they naturalize after 1906? Okay, good, because you're going to get really, really fabulous records. Pre-1906, not so much. The greatest part of this is that the Declaration of Intent and the petition usually lists that town of birth. So knowing the date of birth, the town of birth, that's going to be hugely important. And then starting in 1906, copies of all the documents were filed with the INS, which is now the USCIS. So naturalization records are very, very helpful when your goal is to find the town of origin, the town where they were born. So here's an example of a naturalization record for Albert Einstein. You may have heard of him before. So it says down here that he was born in Ulm, Germany on March 14th, 1879, that he's married. His wife is Elsa, and it says they were married April 6, 1917 at Berlin, Germany, that she was born in Hechingen, Germany on January 18th, 1877. They entered the United States in New York on June 3rd, 1935, and then it also lists his children and their dates and places of birth, which is awesome, and that they both reside in Switzerland currently. So really, really good information, especially those post-1906 naturalizations. Don't forget that military records can also have a lot of value when you're trying to figure out that town of birth. So consider enlistment records, pension records, draft registration cards, discharge records, personnel files. They all have the potential to list a town of birth. And keep in mind that 20th century military records are just more likely to include that town of birth. So here's an example of the record for, this is a World War II draft card for Charles Spencer Chaplin. And on this particular card, they actually asked for your place of birth, the town of birth. And in this case, that was London, England. And he was born April 16th, 1889. Now, you might be wondering exactly why Charlie Chaplin, at the age of 53, was registering for the draft. Well, that's because in World War II, there was a question of, if we draft all of the young men, how many older men are left for the workforce? And they didn't really have an answer to that question, so they actually did what's called the fourth draft, or the old man's draft, was for men in this age group. And so you can find some of these immigrants who might have come pre-1900 or immigrated pre-1900 might still have a World War II draft card. So don't forget to go to those records later in life. Kind of on the same note, it just kind of occurred to me, don't forget to look for Social Security applications as well for your immigrants. Okay, so those are where you want to start. What are the actual records here in the United States that are going to start giving you some clues that you can start correlating about where your ancestor was born, the town, and what date were they born, and if they have relatives that they immigrated with, or even knowing their parents' names, that's going to help, so that when you get back into researching in England or Spain or Germany or Italy, that you know that you found the right person with that name. So next I want to talk about some of the immigration records themselves that were created by the United States, so we can kind of see what they contain. We'll start with the passenger lists. There are kind of two time periods for passenger lists, and just for the ease of discussion, we're going to call the first set the customs lists from 1820 to 1891. This is because these lists were filed at the customs with the customs agent at the port of arrival. So these customs lists, all they required was the name of the individual, their age, their gender, their occupation, their country of origin, and their intended country of settlement. So you'll notice they're not requiring a lot of information, which makes them a little less helpful when you're trying to figure out where they came from, but at least you can track, when they arrived and the ship they arrived on, and sometimes family members. The other issue with this time period were there actually no official forms. So the federal government wasn't printing forms and asking people to fill them out. They just said, this is what's required, and you design your own form. That does mean that gives the possibility, though, that some of the more energetic ship's captains might have added a few extra columns of their own that can be helpful. So keep that in mind. So here's an example of a customs list. You'll notice just not a lot of information. Here we have an entry for a 3-year-old child named Eric Weiss, who was coming from Hungary with the intended destination of the United States. Anyone know who Eric Weiss was? He's better known as Harry Houdini, the escape artist. So here it's his immigration. You'll notice he actually came with a family with a couple of siblings and parents. Now, after 1891, after that big Immigration Act, the government did start printing forms, and then they also would increase the types of information required. So instead of just kind of the limits to what we saw pre-1891, we get their name and age, occupation, name, age, and gender is still there, nationality, their marital status, the name of a relative, and their final destination in the United States. So they want to verify that these people have a place to go to. Their last residence, where they previously resided, their town of birth, starting in 1906. You'll notice that ties into the Naturalization Act. The name and address of their closest living relative in their homeland. That is awesome, because not only do you have, a town where they might be coming from, but you have the name and a specific street address. That can be very helpful. And there's a lot more questions asked on these later immigration lists. So make sure that you are looking for these later ones. Note that most of these, especially the ones starting after around 1906, around that time period, are actually 2-page manifests. And so you want to make sure that you get both pages of that manifest. Note if you're working with ellisisland.org that they sometimes put those pages out of order. So the second page might be before the one you're looking at, it might be after the one. Here's an example of one of these immigration lists. You'll notice, again, it's 2 pages, and this one happened to be typed. So lots and lots and lots of information. So read all the headings. There's lots of good questions. Are you an anarchist? Are you a polygamist? There's a couple questions like that, verifying, you get their height, their physical description. But let's take a look at this entry here for a man named Howard Carter. Some of you may have heard of Howard Carter. He is very well known because he discovered King Tut's tomb in Egypt. So you'll get that his name is Howard Carter. His age, he's 49 years. His occupation, he's an archaeologist. His last permanent residence was Luxor, Egypt. We find that his closest relative was Samuel Carter in London, with a street address, even in London, that he paid the passage for himself. He's got $50, never been to the US. He's actually the friend he's joining is the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He is planning to return home. He's 5 feet 8 inches with a sallow complexion, brown hair, brown eyes. He has a scar and knuckle on the knuckles of his left hand, and he was born in Swaffham, England. So lots of great information in this passenger list. So make sure you're getting that second page of the manifest if there is one. Next, let's talk about border crossings from Canada and Mexico. Starting with Canada, I had mentioned that the 1891 Immigration Act allowed for the creation of border stations on the Canadian border. The first border station didn't open until 1895, and they're going to start moving westward. So still there are going to be places post 1895, that are further west that you might just be crossing the border without a passenger list. And prior to 1906, they actually didn't record people who were Canadian. So if a Canadian wanted to cross the border, they just did. And so people, you might find your immigrant came to Canada, lived for 3 years, and now considers themselves a Canadian and then crossed the border without a border crossing. That could help as well. There were no standard forms or manifests used, so sometimes they're manifests, sometimes they're cards. Mexico's the same way. They didn't start actually, their first border station opened in 1895 in Presidio, Texas. Same like Canada, you'll get different start dates, and again, no standard forms used. So here's an example of a Canadian border crossing. This is actually recorded a little bit later. There was a change in naturalization in the 1920s, but here we get that this person who's now going by Frank de Masi was originally Francesco de Meo, and you get a lot of other great information, including his town of birth in Italy. Here's an example of a border crossing from Mexico. I love both these cards because they had pictures. And one of my favorite things about this card is that they included a picture of his wife and children on the back of the card. So, because they were crossing the border together. So and it lists the name of his wife and the children and their ages. Another record we can use is our passport applications. They're not officially immigration, but they're adjacent. Naturalized citizens oftentimes returned home. And a passport was originally, they were issued for diplomatic purposes, but over time, what they became useful for, especially in those locations that had things like required military service, that maybe a young man had decided not to do that and instead to immigrate. Well, if he came back and said, I'm a naturalized citizen of the US, you can't make me serve in the military, they might say, yeah, prove it. And that's what the passport could help with. So it became kind of evidence that they had naturalized and that they had changed their loyalty to the US. And so they were no longer subject to some of those things. That passports themselves weren't actually required until the 20th century. So you'll see more and more of them as time goes on. Required information to apply for a passport included the date and place of birth, their date and place of naturalization, and their current residence. So here's an example. This is Irving Berlin, who is an early composer, things like White Christmas. And it says he was born in Mogilev, Russia, May 11th, 1888. His father is Moses Belin, who was born in Russia, and he is now residing at dead, meaning he's deceased, and that he immigrated to the United States sailing from Russia in 1892. So keep in mind, those are some records you can look at that are directly immigration related, immigration adjacent. So next I want to just touch on some homeland records. We're not going to do a lot of depth here because you want to take the country where your ancestor came from and go learn about how people immigrated from that specific country. But here we're talking more about the US. Just keep in mind there are a few countrywide indexes, but there are not a lot, meaning somebody brought together a lot of records for that country. This is what we would, everyone's like, oh, where's the list of everyone born in Germany? Unfortunately, that it doesn't exist. So instead, you're going to have to, do all the US stuff that you can and then move to the country of origin. So these are usually incomplete, but there are a couple of situations in which they can be more helpful. And it can be really hard to pick out your ancestor if you haven't done any research in the US, because how many Johann Schmidts are in Germany who were born in Germany, even in that 1 year? And so the more you know from the US before you start looking at these, but they're good to use, you can try them out when you kind of run out of any other possibilities. Some examples, there's some family search collections, the old IGI or International Genealogical Index. Again, they were incomplete, but kind of keep in mind, then there are some countries that do really good, like Sweden and Norway, or the UK actually recorded every birth, marriage, and death starting in 1837, or tried to, and they have put some indexes for births and deaths online through the General Register Office, and that's what their website looks like. So you can actually search for people. But again, I would start with the US records so that you're picking out the right person in England. There are a few immigration records, meaning records of somebody leaving a country or departing from a specific port. So sometimes the country would keep track of people leaving and sometimes the port would. There are records available for England, but not until 1890s. There are some ports in Germany, Norway, Sweden, Denmark again, you want to learn about the country that your ancestor came from and how they were tracking people leaving. So this is an example from the Hamburg passenger list that indicates that this Christine Kaiser was leaving the country. So again, another resource that you can look. And then the last one I'm just going to discuss briefly here are surname distribution maps. This is something that you can use when you've gotten a little bit, you have no other avenues. You've exhausted all the US records, all the immigration that you can find for departure. Surname distribution maps are just showing where surnames are most prevalent in a country. So they're just, again, how many people with that surname to give you a starting point in the country of origin, but again, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. You can find this particular page with links to a lot of surname distribution maps in the Family Search Research Wiki. I kind of want to end here with talking about some research strategies. How do you tackle an immigration case? Well, a couple things to keep in mind. We've talked about the main one, which is do the US records first and then move to the country of origin, to the homeland. But a couple other things is don't forget cluster methodology or fan club research. Fan club stands for family, associates, and neighbors. Just keep in mind that people tended to immigrate or settle around people from their same origin. So other people named on a records, they may share a common origin. And look for others named on your ancestors' records, witnesses, guardians, executors or administrators, neighbors, godparents, anybody else named in your ancestors' records might be connected. And then you want to research them thoroughly and see, maybe you can figure out where they came from in Germany, and lo and behold, there's your ancestor right next door or part of the same community. So let me show you an example here. Here's one of my ancestors, Johann Nabla. He actually came in, this is 1856, at the age of 15. You'll notice that he's listed right below Andres Fry, and I'm probably saying his name wrong, but who's 29. So he's listed, there is a break after that, so maybe it's a family grouping or just happenstance, but he's listed right below him. So I've done a lot of research on John. I found him here in the US. I traced him to his death, and I figured out where he came from. He actually came from Württemberg, which has really good immigration records. They wanted to know who's leaving the country. And here is his application for immigration. And lo and behold, who is signing his documents is that same Andre Fry. So keep in mind, again, this person that I kind of ignored off the passenger list actually was who he was immigrating with. He was coming with him. Don't forget to look for name variations. Your ancestor's name was probably anglicized at some point. Either it was as longer or shorter, or names have changed or gotten just made easier to say in English, and so you want to kind of understand what that original name was. So make sure you're looking for initials, middle names, nicknames, maiden names, longer variations, or try and find the original spelling. You'll notice the list on the right side is something I came up with, but these are all the same name, Margaret Smith, just with different languages and different spellings. So they're all kind of the same thing. Look for the English equivalent of a foreign surname. I helped a guest once who I spent a lot of time. They kept telling me that the surname was King, and we were looking in California, but they said, oh, but they're from Quebec originally. So I looked and looked for King, and then I finally found the family under the surname Roy, R-O-I, which is French for king. So they were a king, but they were under the French version of king. So keep that in mind, that you might want to just translate the name and see what it comes out to be. And then learn about the language, the traditions of the homeland. Again, knowing more about just the country itself is going to give you some understanding of how they immigrated, why they immigrated, and maybe if they might have used a maiden name, because there were some countries in which women would travel under their maiden name, not their married name. So as an example, I went and I found the surname William, and I just used Wikipedia, and I found all of the variations of William, Wilhelm, Willem, Guillermo, so forth. You just got a lot of different versions, and they're all the name William. So they might have been William in the US, but in reality, they may have been baptized in their country of origin with a completely different name. Also look for nicknames like Will or Bill or Liam might be a nickname, or Guy or Guy might be a nickname for William, and so forth. So keep in mind that you don't get stuck on just looking for William, because there's so many other names that he might have gone by. So here's an example of a surname variation. So I've got 3 marriage records. We've got William Basin, Robert Basin, and George Basin. And you'll notice all 3 of them, I kind of covered it up already, all have the same parents' names, which are William Basin and Anna Melda. Now, these 3 married about 1940, 41, 42 in Cleveland, Ohio. I went looking for the family in the 1930 census, and what do I discover? Again, there's the 3 kids, William, Robert, and George. Is William and Anna, the parents, with William, Robert, and George, but the surname wasn't Basin, B-A-S-E-N, it was Basin-Dosky. And you kind of want to think what was going on in that time period that might have encouraged them to drop the end of the surname. Well, think about World War II and who's on what side in that conflict. This family might have been like, we want to get away from our immigration roots, so we're going to just shorten the name. And from then on, they're probably the Basin family, not realizing that there was a longer version. Okay, with ethnic groups, keep in mind that you want to understand the ethnic group of your ancestor. They oftentimes maintain their community. They would settle in areas where their other people came from the same country of origin. Think about like the upper Midwest, like Minnesota, and all of the Norwegians and Norwegian descendants in Minnesota. They're still kind of settled together. So they might have little communities sometimes immigrated as a group, and maybe even through chain migration, and all settled in the same location. They attended the same church, both in their homeland and when they got to the U.S. And it's possible the priest came with them, and the priest will record in the parish records or the church records that town of birth on everyone's records. They can print newspapers, and nowadays you get genealogy societies that are just based on that ethnic group. So if you've got Polish ancestors in Chicago, you might want to reach out to the Chicago Polish Genealogy Society for some help. And then when you really are feeling like you're ready to research in your ancestors' homeland, make sure that you kind of follow this kind of process. So first, you've done all the research in the US, you're going to go back to the country of origin, to that town, and you find somebody you think is the right person. Now, before you immediately say, okay, that's him because he's got the birth date's close enough, the parents are close enough, make sure that you then decide kind of work to disprove that candidate. So you have to identify them in their homeland and then follow them through the rest of their life. Look at marriage records, look at death records. Make sure that that person that you just found and think is your ancestor didn't die as a young child. And that's why they don't have parents or siblings or disappeared. So make sure that you're actually kind of saying, okay, I'm going to try and disprove this is my person before I make the assumption that I've really found the right person. So make sure in the homeland, in the country of origin, that you're looking at birth, marriage, and death records, search in the surrounding localities, just try to disprove that candidate. So really you're trying to say that they disappeared from the records in their homeland about the same time they appear in the United States. I just want to end with some immigration resources. We're going to go through these fast because we're at the end of our time. Ancestry, and I'm going to focus here mostly on naturalization and immigration records because there's a lot of good classes out there to help you find everything else. Ancestry has a collection. They have a ton of immigration records online, but one of the big ones is this Passenger and Immigration List Index 1500s to 1900s. This is actually based on a series of books published by William Philby at the Family Search Library. We call it the Philby books. But it's got about the same title, the Passenger and Immigration List Index. They include they've got New York passenger lists, passport applications, border crossings from both Canada and Mexico. They have immigration records like Hamburg. I'm just highlighting some of their collections. They have a lot on Ancestry. Same with Family Search. Family Search has a huge number of collections. New York, Philadelphia, the passport applications are available up to 1925 on multiple websites. Again, border crossings from Mexico and from New York or from Canada. There's a collection of books called The Germans to America, and Family Search now has an online index to that series of books. They also have, Famine Irish Passenger Index. there's just a lot. Again, I'm highlighting some of the cool collections I spotted on Family Search. Find My Past also has some good collections, such as the passenger list for people leaving the UK from 1890 to 1960. They've got UK passport applications. They also have Germans to America, and they have information on the Irish famine immigrants. And again, and more. There's all of these websites, and there's other websites you can check as well. EllisIsland.org is the Statue of Liberty Foundation, or the Ellis Island Foundation. They kind of run an index of people who came through Ellis Island. And then I'm highlighting a few. Look in your handout for more resources. This is the USCIS, the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, used to be known as the INS, but they hold copies of all naturalization records from 1906 forward, and they do have a genealogy program. So you can look for that if you are looking for the naturalization records, again, to find the town of origin. So again, our objectives today, we went through history and background. We went through the U.S. records that have immigration clues. Then we talked about some immigration records, some homeland records, went through some research strategies, and ended with some resources. So do we have any questions in our last few minutes?
Thank you so much, Beth. That was a fantastic presentation. Before we get into the questions, we would like to invite everyone in our audience today to take a survey and provide feedback for this class. The link has been posted in the chat. So if you have a question, you feel free to put it in the comments section. We probably won't get to everything because we only have a couple minutes left. But we're going to start out with a question from Marie on StreamYard. She said, how do you find the relative's original name in the country of origin if they changed it in America?
That's such a great question. And that's where you really just need to exhaust all of the resources in the US and see if there's just one record that might have that information. Maybe, they spent their whole life as John, but when they were buried in a Catholic cemetery, and that's where the priest then recorded it as Johann. So, make sure that you really are just exhausting everything to try and find it. If they really changed their name, if they completely changed it so it's not even similar, that's a little harder. But again, just everything you can possibly think of, look for it in the US.
Very good. Christine asks, how likely is it that I will find immigration information from an ancestor who landed in Baltimore in 1819? So before that, 1820.
I'm not sure that Baltimore was keeping passenger lists at that point. There are a few situations in which people, some of the newspapers would publish information about incoming passengers. And William Philby in that passenger and immigration list index, actually, anytime somebody runs into, a random passenger list and puts it in a historical or genealogy journal or periodical, they pull it out in index. So I always start with that. How likely you'll find it, I just don't know. Baltimore, as far as I know at that point, wasn't keeping passenger lists, but it doesn't hurt to go look, but you just might not find an actual passenger list that lists the ship like you will after 1820.
Okay, thank you so much. Mary asks, my grandfather was naturalized in the orphans court as a minor. What naturalization papers would have been issued?
I would want to know how he's a minor, but this might be a question. I would actually sign up for a virtual consultation and we could take a closer look at it. But the orphans court, if you're in Pennsylvania, is the probate court. And so I've never heard of a minor being naturalized because I don't think legally you could, but that would be a question actually for Alyssa, who did our naturalization. Alyssa, are you around and can answer that question? If not, then just, yeah. Oh, Alyssa's joining in right now.
Yeah, so minors would have received naturalization through their father, unless if their father was attempting to become naturalized and then passed away, then the widow and the minor children could have streamlined the naturalization because they would have received it if the father never passed away and completed the process. So that's the only instance that I can think of why there would be naturalization for a minor.
Okay. And was that the original question, Julia? Did I completely forget what the question was?
No, that was good.
Okay.
Let's do one more question. Cynthia asks, how were stowaways registered or dealt with?
I think this is a personal opinion, but I think the rumor of stowaways is a lot. I think there were a lot fewer stowaways than we all claim. It's very easy to be like, well, I can't find him on a passenger list, therefore he stowed away. But keep in mind that this is if you're found as a stowaway, you may have been recorded on the passenger list, or you may have just been dragged back to the country of origin. If you truly were able to stow away and sneak off the ship, there is absolutely no record of it. There's just, I mean, nobody found you, so you were never caught. So it's like if somebody steals something but never gets caught, there's not going to be a court case about it. Same thing with the passenger list. So if they really truly were a stowaway, and I actually think we have a lot of families stories about stowaways. This is a personal opinion. There's a lot of family stories about stowaways, but I think there are a lot fewer stowaways. Ship's captains and ship's crews are going to be very careful about stowaways because it's taking money out of their pockets pretty much to have a stowaway on board eating the food and things like that. So I think they'd be very aware. If they're caught, I'm not exactly sure how they're dealt with. That would be an interesting question. You might check online, maybe look at like JSTOR or other places and see if anyone's written some articles about stowaways, what they can find about them. Also keep in mind, though, I think that some of the reason people assume their ancestor was a stowaway is you can't find them on a passenger list. But one of the big groups of people that are missing from the passenger list are the crew members. And there were people who would sign up and work their way across the ocean. So they might not have been a stowaway, they just worked as crew instead. And those do appear in later passenger lists, but not early ones. They're not listed at all. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Beth. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar.